The courthouse on Main Street had seen its share of trials, murders, robberies, scandals that drew entire neighborhoods into the gallery. Yet on that particular morning, the atmosphere inside the tall, wood-paneled courtroom carried a unique kind of tension. Reporters huddled together at the back, whispering about the case that had shaken the community. Uniformed officers lined the walls, arms folded, their faces grim. Jurors sat stiffly in their chairs, avoiding eye contact with one another, as if already burdened by the weight of the verdict that awaited them. At the center of this storm sat a figure so small, so out of place, that many could hardly believe their eyes. A 3-year-old child, their legs dangling from a wooden chair, far too big for them. The child's presence stirred curiosity from the gallery. People leaned forward, whispering, "Why is a toddler here?" Some speculated the child was there out of necessity, with no one else to care for them during the long trial hours. Others assumed the child was connected to the case somehow, though no one could piece together how such a young voice could possibly matter in the machinery of justice. The judge, a stern but fair man known for his composure, had noticed the child immediately. Yet, with the formality of proceedings weighing on him, he gave no sign of distraction. He straightened his black robe and tapped the gavel lightly, bringing order to the court. Lawyers shuffled their papers, adjusted their ties, and prepared to launch once more into their battle of words. Still, eyes returned, again and again, to the toddler. The child clutched a stuffed bear, its fur worn, one button eye slightly loose, its seams showing signs of countless nights of comfort. To the child, this toy was a shield in a room that felt enormous, intimidating, and filled with voices too loud to comprehend. The child's wide eyes scanned the room with innocent curiosity. Yet there was something almost searching in that gaze, as though they were trying to understand the invisible war being waged all around them. To the adults, the case was a complex tangle of evidence, testimony, and arguments. But to a child, the world was simpler good and bad, trust and fear, truth and lies. And sometimes, that simplicity could see more clearly than the sharpest legal mind. The prosecution table was stacked with binders, photos, and thick envelopes. Their lead attorney, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and sharper words, adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. She was prepared to tear through every detail of the case, determined to convince the jury of guilt. Across the aisle, the defense attorney sat with practiced calm, ready to counter every argument with doubt and hesitation. The accused man, seated beside him, avoided looking at the jury, his expression stiff, though his hands betrayed him, trembling ever so slightly on the table. In the midst of this adult battlefield, the 3-year-old seemed like an island of innocence. Yet, as the minutes stretched into hours, something subtle began to unfold. Every time the accused shifted in his chair, the child's head tilted. Every time a witness spoke, the child's gaze darted toward them, studying, as though picking up on signals that the adults dismissed. Children, after all, often noticed what others ignored. The court clerk called the next witness. A hush fell over the room. Testimonies carried weight here, every word recorded, every gesture scrutinized. The witness swore an oath, and the lawyers launched once more into their well-practiced dance. But no matter how impassioned the arguments became, the toddler seemed only half aware of them. Their focus, oddly enough, lingered on the tall doors at the back of the courtroom. Then it happened. The faint sound of claws clicking against polished marble floors echoed from the hallway outside. Some heads turned curiously, while others ignored it, too engrossed in the case at hand. But the child heard it clearly, and their bodies stiffened. Their little hands tightened around the stuffed bear, their eyes wide with anticipation. The sound grew louder until the heavy doors creaked open. Into the solemn space walked a police officer, and beside him, trotting calmly, was a large German shepherd. The dog's coat gleamed under the courtroom lights, its posture regal, every step measured. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The judge raised a hand for silence, but even he could not deny the quiet shift in the room's atmosphere. The police dog was not an ordinary spectator. It was part of the K-9 unit, trained for discipline, protection, and above all, truth. Its mere presence commanded respect. The officer guided the dog to a corner near the witness stand, where it sat, still as stone, its eyes scanning the room. To many, it was just procedure, an added precaution for a case with sensitive testimony. But for the child, the dog was something else entirely. The moment their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. The toddler's lips parted, their head tilted, and for a brief second, the stuffed bear dropped to their lap as both hands gripped the edge of the chair. They didn't look at the lawyers or the judge or even the accused. They looked only at the dog, as if recognizing a friend in a place filled with strangers. The adults might not have noticed the connection, but the dog did. Its ears twitched, its gaze sharpened, and it tilted its head ever so slightly in return. It wasn't communication in words, but in something deeper: instinct, trust, a kind of unspoken understanding only children and animals seem to share. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing a tension they couldn't quite name. The accused cleared his throat, glanced nervously toward the dog, then quickly looked away. The defense attorney whispered something in his ear, urging calm. The prosecution, oblivious to the silent exchange, continued to prepare for the next round of questioning. Yet, amid the swirl of adult drama, the smallest voice in the room remained silent for now. A toddler sat still, eyes fixed on the dog, waiting. It was as though they knew, in their pure, untainted way, that this animal wasn't just there to observe. It was there to reveal. And when the moment came, it wouldn't be the lawyers, the judge, or even the evidence that shifted the course of the trial. It would be the child. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but history was about to remember this day, not for the case itself, but for the moment when a 3-year-old, armed with nothing but innocence and 2 simple words, left an entire room speechless. The stage was set. The silence before the storm had begun. The heavy wooden doors creaked as they swung open again, drawing the attention of nearly everyone inside the courtroom. A ripple of whispers followed, as though a new wave of tension had just entered the space. At first, people expected another witness or a late-arriving official. But then the sound came again, soft, rhythmic, deliberate. Click, click, click. The sound of claws against polished marble echoed through the chamber. The officer stepped inside first, his posture straight, his uniform crisp, his hand steady on the leash he held. But it wasn't the officer that drew every pair of eyes. It was the animal at his side. A large German shepherd, its coat a striking blend of sable and black, walked with quiet authority. It didn't bark. It didn't pull. It didn't flinch. Its movements were fluid, its gaze sharp, as though it knew this room belonged to no one, not even the lawyers, not even the judge, but to the truth itself. The courtroom collectively inhaled. Even those who had seen police dogs before felt something different now. Maybe it was the stillness in the shepherd's steps, maybe the weight of its presence. The dog wasn't just walking in. It was arriving. And with it came the kind of silence that only respect or fear could command. The officer guided the dog toward the front, past the jury box, toward a designated space near the witness stand. Each step seemed measured, as though rehearsed, but it wasn't. The dog didn't need rehearsal. It had been trained to enter rooms filled with danger, to sniff out lies, to protect, to comfort, to reveal. For the jurors, it was a reminder of the gravity of the case before them. For the accused, it was a silent weight pressing harder against his chest. His eyes darted briefly to the shepherd, then away just as quickly, but not before the jury noticed his unease. One juror leaned slightly forward, brows raised. Another whispered something to the person beside them, their lips tight with curiosity. And then there was the child. The 3-year-old, who had been fidgeting moments earlier, froze. The stuffed bear slipped from their tiny hands and landed softly on their lap, forgotten. Their eyes widened not in fear, not in confusion, but in recognition. For a moment, it seemed as though the dog had walked in solely for them. The shepherd's head turned just slightly, its dark eyes locking on the child. Its ears twitched forward. To the adults in the room, it looked like nothing more than a dog scanning its environment. But to the child, it was different. Their lips parted, their breath caught, and they leaned forward in their oversized chair. A spark of connection passed between them, silent, invisible, undeniable. The officer gave a subtle command, and the dog sat, tall and still, its attention never truly leaving the child. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the spell, and announced the reason for the dog's presence. He explained calmly that the canine was there as part of standard courtroom protocol, to provide reassurance to vulnerable witnesses, and to maintain order if necessary. His voice carried authority, but there was something in the way the audience listened, half to him, half to the animal. The dog didn't need an introduction. Its presence spoke louder than words. The defense attorney, smooth and calculating, pretended not to notice. He adjusted his tie, leaned back in his chair, and scribbled something on a notepad. But his client, the accused man, couldn't disguise his reaction so easily. He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, and for the first time since the trial began, broke eye contact with the jury altogether. His gaze flickered toward the floor, then toward the dog, then quickly away. The prosecutor noticed. Her sharp eyes didn't miss details, and she made a mental note of the man's discomfort. It wasn't evidence, not yet, but it was something. Meanwhile, the child's focus never wavered. Their small chest rose and fell quickly, as though something inside them stirred. They had seen the man on trial before, though their memories were blurry, fragmented by the haze of being so young. But something about the dog made it clearer, safer, stronger. The toddler didn't fully understand what was happening in the courtroom, but they understood what their heart told them. The dog was good, and the man was not. The gallery whispered softly, some curious about the child's reaction, others about the accused's unease. But when the judge raised his gavel lightly, the room fell into silence again. The trial had to continue, no matter the distractions. Still, the atmosphere had changed. A first witness of the day returned to the stand. Their voice wavered as they described events, trying to recall details under the piercing stares of lawyers and jurors. As the questioning continued, the dog remained motionless, but not idle. Its eyes tracked movements, its ears flicked at tones of voice. Trained handlers knew these signs. This wasn't just obedience. The animal was working, assessing, analyzing, perhaps even judging. The jurors noticed too. While the lawyers argued, some stole glances at the shepherd, as though waiting for it to give away the truth, with a twitch of an ear or the shift of a paw. Human words were messy, tangled in strategy and persuasion. But the dog, there was something about its silence that seemed more honest than anything said aloud. At the prosecution's table, the attorney grew bolder. She pointed to evidence, questioned inconsistencies, and pressed the witness hard. The dog didn't move, but when the accused leaned forward to whisper to his lawyer, its gaze snapped to him. The jurors noticed that too. And the child? They whispered something barely audible, clutching their bear again. No one caught the words, but their eyes glistened with a kind of clarity that no one else in the room possessed. The trial rolled on. Words flew like daggers across the courtroom, but the shepherd's calm presence loomed larger than the arguments. And with each passing minute, The bond between the child and the dog grew stronger, though neither had spoken a word. It was as if fate had walked the dog into that room for a single purpose, not to guard, not to intimidate, but to stand as the silent witness to truth. And the smallest person in the room, the one everyone had overlooked, seemed to be the only one who understood. The courtroom was a place designed for formality, not childhood. The mahogany walls rose tall and unyielding, lined with flags and portraits of past judges. Heavy chandeliers cast golden light across polished floors, and every seat creaked with the weight of adults who carried opinions, fears, or responsibilities. Yet in the middle of all this, the presence of a 3-year-old child created an odd contrast, a small ripple of innocence in an ocean of gravity. The toddler sat slouched in the oversized wooden chair, their small legs dangling far from the floor. Each time they swung their feet absent-mindedly, the sound of tiny shoes knocking against the chair legs echoed softly, almost musical compared to the stern rhythm of gavels and the sharp cadence of lawyers' voices. It was the kind of sound that should have been scolded or shushed in such a serious setting, but no one dared to silence the child. The innocence was disarming. At one moment, the toddler pressed their face into the worn fur of the stuffed bear, as though hiding from the storm of adult voices that clashed around them. At another, their eyes wandered freely curious, searching. They weren't following the legal jargon. They couldn't, but children didn't need complicated words to understand things adults often ignored. They understood fear. They understood kindness. They understood when something felt wrong. The police dog remained seated near the witness stand, silent and majestic, but every so often its dark eyes flicked toward the child. Each time it did, the toddler froze for a second, wide-eyed, before giving the faintest of smiles, as if reassured. The stuffed bear dropped into their lap once more as tiny hands reached out in the dog's direction, though the distance between them was too great to bridge. The jury noticed. Not all at once, not overtly, but in the way humans notice small disruptions to order. A few jurors exchanged quick glances, their eyes darting between the child and the animal. For them, this wasn't just a trial anymore. It was becoming a story, unfolding in ways none of them expected. The quiet bond between innocence and loyalty pulled at something in their hearts, reminding them of a world simpler than crime, evidence, and doubt. Meanwhile, the lawyers continued their duel. The prosecutor's voice rose with intensity as she dissected testimony, her words like arrows aimed directly at the accused. She spoke of timelines, motives, inconsistencies, and alibis. Each point was sharp, deliberate, meant to cut through any defense. Across from her, the defense attorney parried with questions that seeded doubt, casting shadows over the prosecutor's certainty. His voice was smoother, quieter, a calm contrast to her fire. But as their battle raged on, the child seemed to drift in and out of their own world. They leaned sideways, eyes narrowing as they studied the man on trial. His every twitch, every frown, seemed to draw the toddler's attention. Then their gaze would wander back to the dog, who hadn't moved except to occasionally tilt its head or flick an ear at sudden noises. It was strange, almost uncanny, how the toddler seemed less interested in the adults who spoke endlessly and more fascinated with the one who said nothing. The dog. The accused noticed too. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on his lawyer's whispered reassurances, but every time his gaze drifted toward the child, he felt a prickle down his spine. The child's stare wasn't like that of the jury or the prosecutor. It wasn't filled with logic or suspicion. It was pure, unclouded observation, and that made it harder to endure. He shifted in his seat. The dog's head turned, tracking the movement. The child noticed, their little hand clutching the bear tightly. The gallery whispered again, but this time the bailiff raised a hand, silencing them. The judge cleared his throat, irritation flickering across his face. He was a man of discipline, not easily distracted, but even he felt the subtle shift in the room's energy. Something intangible was growing, an unspoken current that tied the child, the dog, and the accused together in a triangle of silent tension. The next witness was called, a neighbor who spoke with hesitation. Her voice trembled as she recounted events, her words halting as though dragged from her throat by force. She avoided looking at the accused. Her eyes, instead, darted toward the dog, then toward the jury, then quickly down to her hands. The child, however, leaned forward, eyes fixed intently on the woman. Though too young to follow the details, the toddler sensed the fear in her tone, the truth buried within her stammers. They turned toward the dog again, as though asking silently, "Is she telling the truth?" The dog didn't answer, not in words, but its stillness seemed to affirm something the child already believed. It wasn't lost on the jury. For weeks they had listened to testimony, weighed evidence, and scribbled notes, but nothing had struck them quite like this small exchange. It wasn't evidence, not in any legal sense, but it was powerful all the same. The prosecutor pressed harder, trying to build momentum, while the defense countered with objections. The judge sustained, overruled, kept the balance steady. But while adults clashed in technicalities, the child's steady, innocent attention wove its own quiet narrative, and the accused was unraveling under it. At one point, he looked up suddenly, locking eyes with the child. For a moment, the courtroom froze, not because of any official statement, but because of what passed silently between them. The child's eyes widened, not with fear, but with recognition. The man's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He looked away quickly, but it was too late. Everyone had seen it. The jury shifted again, some scribbling notes, others exchanging pointed glances. The police dog lifted its head, ears twitching, eyes sharp. Its gaze followed the accused until he leaned back in his chair. Only then did the shepherd rest its chin lightly on its paws, still watching, still listening. The child exhaled softly and hugged their bear again. The innocence in their movements was unshakable, but it wasn't weakness. It was a different kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need law books or evidence charts to see the truth. By the time the recess was called, the courtroom was buzzing. Lawyers whispered strategies, jurors stretched stiffly, and reporters scribbled notes furiously. Yet amid the noise, one image lingered in everyone's mind, the silent bond between a 3-year-old child and a police dog, and the way that bond seemed to pierce straight through the web of lies and fear. The accused rubbed his temples, pretending to be weary, but the sheen of sweat along his hairline betrayed him. His lawyer leaned close, whispering reassurance, but his eyes kept darting first to the jury, then to the dog, and finally to the child who still sat quietly, clutching a stuffed bear that suddenly seemed like more than just a toy. Innocence had entered the courtroom, uninvited yet undeniable. And with it came a truth no one could put into words, at least not yet. The trial would continue. The lawyers would keep fighting. The evidence would keep piling. But everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, felt it. Something bigger than procedure was at work here. Something pure, something unexplainable. And it sat in the form of a child with wide eyes and a stuffed bear, whose silence carried more weight than any adult speech. The gavel struck once more, sharp and commanding. The murmurs faded into silence, and all eyes turned toward the front of the courtroom. The judge, expression stern but weary, adjusted his glasses and gave a slight nod to the prosecution. The floor was theirs. The prosecutor rose from her chair, like a soldier preparing for battle. Every movement was deliberate, straightening the stack of papers before her, adjusting her glasses, pacing once to the edge of the jury box before speaking. Her voice, calm yet powerful, carried across the room with ease. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "what we have before us is not just a case of evidence and testimony. It is a case of truth versus lies. You have heard witnesses, you have seen documents, and today we will walk through them step by step." She gestured toward the screen, where photos were displayed, images of the crime scene, fragments of evidence, timelines carefully constructed. One by one, she laid them out like puzzle pieces, her words weaving them into a story that made sense, that carried weight. The jury leaned forward, pens scratching across paper. They were tired. Weeks of testimony had drained them, but the prosecutor's energy rekindled their attention. She spoke with conviction, but not theatrics. Her strength lay in clarity. Yet, as strong as her arguments were, the defense was ready. When she finished, the defense attorney stood slowly, smoothing his suit jacket with practiced calm. Where the prosecutor was sharp, he was smooth. Where she was fiery, he was controlled. His voice carried no edge, only a softness designed to soothe, to make the jury question what they had just heard. "Members of the jury," he said, with a tone almost sympathetic, "we are not here to listen to stories. We are here to evaluate facts. And facts, as you will see, do not point to guilt." He walked casually along the jury box, hands clasped behind his back, like a teacher strolling through a classroom. He poked holes in the prosecutor's narrative, raising questions that hovered in the air like shadows. He reminded the jury that doubt, no matter how small, was enough to protect the accused. The tug-of-war had begun. The prosecutor pushed forward with evidence: cell phone records, witness testimonies, forensic reports. The defense countered with alternative explanations, painting every strong point with a brush of uncertainty. The jury's heads turned back and forth, like spectators at a tennis match, their expressions shifting from interest to doubt, from certainty to confusion. Through it all, the child sat quietly, swinging their little legs. They did not understand the intricacies of timelines or phone records, but their eyes never left the accused for long. Every time the man's lips tightened or his eyes flickered nervously, the child noticed. And so did the dog. The German shepherd remained at its post, still and regal, but its eyes followed movements most others overlooked. When the accused whispered urgently to his lawyer, the dog's ears twitched. When the man shifted uncomfortably during the prosecutor's accusations, the dog's gaze sharpened. To the trained handler, these were signals. To the jury, though less obvious, the unease was becoming harder to ignore. The defense attorney continued, his tone persuasive. "The prosecution wants you to believe in absolutes. But life, as we know, is rarely absolute. Doubt exists, and where doubt exists, you must find in favor of the accused." The jurors listened, some nodding faintly, others scribbling furiously. Doubt was a powerful weapon. But then came the prosecution's rebuttal. She rose again, eyes blazing, her voice louder now. "Doubt," she said, stabbing the air with her finger, "is not the same as truth. You have heard from the witnesses. You have seen the evidence. And while the defense would have you chase shadows, the truth stands firm." The energy between the two lawyers filled the room, bouncing back and forth, but as they sparred, the child shifted again. They hugged their stuffed bear, eyes fixed on the man at the defense table. In their innocence, there was no tug-of-war. There was only recognition. At one point, the man on trial looked up and accidentally locked eyes with the toddler again. His lawyer was speaking, trying to plant seeds of doubt, but the child's stare felt like a mirror he could not look away from. His chest tightened, his breath hitched. He broke eye contact, but it was too late. The jurors had noticed his discomfort. The police dog lifted its head then, ears perked, eyes sharp. It didn't move, didn't growl, didn't bark. It simply watched. And the room, though caught in the lawyer's theatrics, seemed to sense it too. The battle of words raged on for hours. Timelines clashed, motives were debated, witnesses were revisited. The jurors tried to keep pace, though their expressions grew heavier, more strained. Some rubbed their temples, others glanced at the clock. The sheer volume of arguments threatened to drown them. But amid the storm of words, two figures remained untouched by the chaos, the child and the dog. Silent, still, watching. And sometimes, silence is louder than words. When the recess was finally called, the judge exhaled heavily, rubbing his eyes. The lawyers gathered their papers, their faces set with exhaustion, but determination. The jurors stretched, murmuring softly among themselves, their minds spinning with conflicting arguments. The accused leaned close to his attorney, whispering urgently. His hands trembled slightly, his jaw clenched. His lawyer nodded, offering calm reassurance, but the man's eyes betrayed him. They darted again and again toward the child and the dog, as though haunted by their quiet presence. The toddler, oblivious to the weight of adult worry, giggled softly as they hugged their bear. To them, it was just another long day in a room full of strangers. Yet, in their innocence, they had seen more truth than all the lawyers combined. The police dog yawned quietly, lowering its head back to its paws. Its eyes, however, remained open, locked on the accused. The trial would continue. A battle of words was far from over. But slowly, subtly, the tide was shifting. Not because of the arguments, not because of the evidence, but because of the simplest things: a child's gaze, a dog's silence, and the uneasy truth that no lawyer could argue away. The jury felt it. The judge sensed it. And deep down, the accused knew it too. The hours of testimony had worn down the courtroom. The air felt heavy, thick with the residue of arguments and evidence that clashed like storm clouds. Jurors shifted uneasily in their seats, exhausted by the duel of words between prosecution and defense. Even the judge, whose face was normally unreadable, showed faint signs of fatigue, the creases at the corners of his eyes deeper now, his gavel resting in his hand like a weight he'd grown tired of carrying. When the final witness stepped down, a hush fell over the room. No one expected silence to feel so loud. For the first time in hours, there were no questions, no objections, no voices filling the chamber. Just stillness. The prosecutor closed her folder, lips pressed into a firm line, her body taut with determination. The defense attorney leaned back, calm on the outside, but calculating within, whispering something quickly to his client. The accused man nodded stiffly, but the beads of sweat forming along his hairline betrayed his unease. In that pause, the child stirred. For much of the day, the 3-year-old had sat quietly, their little legs swinging, their hands clutching the worn stuffed bear that had become their anchor in the storm. The child had been overlooked by most adults, dismissed as too young to matter. But now, in the silence, the toddler's movements were impossible to ignore. First, a small shift the stuffed bear slipped from the child's lap and landed softly on the wooden floor. The sound was barely a thud, but in the quiet courtroom, it echoed louder than it should have. Heads turned. The child leaned down clumsily to retrieve it, tiny hands fumbling against the chair. Then, instead of sitting back, they stood. A murmur rose from the gallery. The toddler's guardian, a weary aunt who had been watching nervously from the bench, started to rise, ready to pull the child back down. But before she could, the judge raised a hand. His voice was calm but curious. "Let the child be." The words hung in the air, surprising everyone, even himself. It wasn't procedure, not by any means, but something about the moment, something about the weight of silence, made him pause. The child stood fully now, small and wobbly, gripping the stuffed bear in one hand. Their eyes didn't scan the room the way adults did. They weren't looking at the jury or the lawyers or even the judge. They were looking straight at the police dog. The German shepherd had not moved for hours. Still as stone, it had watched, listened, measured. But now, as the child took a hesitant step forward, the dog lifted its head. Its ears perked, its eyes locked onto the toddler, and for the first time all day, it rose to its feet. The handler tensed, ready to give a command, but the dog didn't lunge, didn't bark. It simply stood tall, as though acknowledging the child's courage. The jurors leaned forward, whispering among themselves. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture every detail of the unexpected moment. The accused shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table. The child took another step. A bear dangled by its arm, swinging softly as the toddler's small shoes tapped against the courtroom floor. Tap, tap. Each sound was louder than it should have been, amplified by the silence. The child stopped halfway between the gallery and the dog, their tiny frame dwarfed by the towering walls and the heavy oak furniture. Their lips parted, but no sound came. For a moment, it seemed as though the weight of the room the eyes of strangers. The solemnity of the trial was too much for someone so young. Then the police dog moved. It lowered its head slightly, ears twitching, as if encouraging the child. The toddler's shoulders lifted with a shaky breath, and suddenly, their eyes left the dog and fixed on the man at the defense table. The accused froze. His chest rose sharply, his eyes flicked toward the child, and his face drained of color. He opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, perhaps to protest, but no words came. The silence grew unbearable. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of anticipation, of hearts pounding, of everyone waiting for something they didn't know was coming, but knew they couldn't stop. The judge leaned forward in his seat, eyebrows furrowed. Jurors sat motionless, their pens hovering above their notebooks, forgotten. Even the lawyers, who had spent weeks drowning the room with words, were silent now, powerless before the unfolding scene. The child lifted their arm slowly, a tiny finger pointing first at the dog, then at the man. Their lips trembled as they tried to form words. The stuffed bear pressed tightly against their chest with the other hand. The toddler's voice was so soft at first that no one could hear it. But then, with a deep, shaky breath, the child spoke. It wasn't long. It wasn't complex. It wasn't rehearsed. Just 2 words. And though they were small, almost fragile in their delivery, they carried farther, deeper, and heavier than anything said in the courtroom that day. The entire room froze. Gasps echoed. Pens dropped. One juror covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. The judge leaned back slowly, his gavel forgotten. Even the reporters, those trained to remain detached, paused, their notes abandoned mid-sentence. The accused man's face contorted, a storm of anger and fear flickering in his eyes. His lawyer reached for his arm, whispering urgently, but he didn't hear. His gaze was fixed solely on the child, whose innocence had just pierced through the armor of his lies. The dog sat down again, calm, steady, as though it had known all along what was coming. The silence after the words felt eternal. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of realization. The kind of silence that happens when truth arrives, undeniable and unshakable. In that moment, it didn't matter what evidence had been presented, what arguments had been made, or what doubts had been sown. All that mattered was that a 3-year-old child, too young to understand the weight of law, had spoken with a clarity no adult could achieve. And the courtroom, filled with seasoned lawyers, skeptical jurors, and weary officials, could do nothing but listen. The silence in the courtroom was unbearable. It was not the ordinary kind of silence, the pause between testimonies or the lull before a recess. This was different. It was thick, almost physical, pressing against every chest in the room. People held their breath without realizing it, eyes locked on the smallest figure standing in the center of it all. The 3-year-old child clutched their stuffed bear so tightly that it seemed stretched at the edges. Their tiny hand trembled as it pointed first at the dog, then at the man seated at the defense table. The dog, steady as stone, stood beside its handler, its eyes locked on the accused. And then, in a voice high-pitched but clear, the child spoke. "Bad man, just 2 words. 2 words so small that, under different circumstances, they might have gone unnoticed. But here, in this sacred chamber where truth was weighed and measured with such painful precision, those 2 words rang louder than any gavel, sharper than any objection, and truer than any sworn testimony." The reaction was instant. Gasps rippled through the gallery, echoing off the wooden panels of the courtroom walls. Jurors stiffened, some with their mouths slightly open, others covering their lips with their hands. One older woman on the jury box leaned forward so far she nearly toppled, her eyes glistening with tears. The prosecutor froze where she stood, papers clutched in her hands, her mouth parting in astonishment. For weeks, she had fought tooth and nail to prove her case with evidence and logic, and yet, here was the most powerful testimony of all delivered by a toddler in just 2 syllables. The defense attorney jolted upright, his calm mask cracking. "Objection," he barked, though his voice wavered. "Your Honor, the child he doesn't understand." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. His gaze, normally stern but detached, was now fixed on the child. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything. Even he knew the weight of what had just been spoken. The accused man sat frozen, his complexion pale, his lips pressed tightly together as though holding back a scream. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles whitened. Beads of sweat rolled down his temple, his body trembling as though the 2 words had stripped away every layer of defense he had left. The dog shifted then, a subtle movement but unmistakable. It sat back on its haunches, its gaze locked on the accused, its ears tilted forward. It wasn't aggression, it was confirmation. A silent, wordless agreement to the child's declaration. The room seemed to bend under the weight of the moment. The defense attorney tried again, his voice desperate. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The testimony of a toddler surely, it cannot be considered valid." His words tumbled out too quickly, too urgently, betraying his fear that the damage had already been done. But the jury wasn't listening to him. Their eyes were on the child. The toddler, oblivious to legalities and procedures, hugged the stuffed bear tighter. They didn't understand the storm they had unleashed. To them, it wasn't testimony. It wasn't strategy. It was simply truth spoken aloud. They had seen something, felt something that only innocence could put into words. The judge finally spoke, his voice steady but softer than usual. "Order in the court." His gavel tapped once, though even the sound of wood on wood seemed muted compared to the echo of the child's words. "The jury will disregard the outburst," he added, though his eyes betrayed him. He knew, as everyone else did, that disregarding was impossible, because truth, once spoken, cannot be unheard. The prosecutor, recovering from her shock, saw her chance. She didn't smile. This wasn't a moment for triumph, but she stepped forward, her voice calm yet firm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have just witnessed what no lawyer, no witness, no piece of evidence could fabricate. The innocence of a child sees what we sometimes cannot. Those 2 words may not be evidence in the legal sense, but they reveal the truth behind the evidence you do have." The defense attorney slammed his palm on the table. "This is outrageous. We cannot allow the emotions of a toddler to sway justice." But the damage was already done. The jury had seen the accused's reaction. They had felt the shift in the room. His guilt, once hidden behind arguments and technicalities, now stood exposed, raw and undeniable. The accused muttered something under his breath, too soft for most to hear, but the dog's ears twitched, its head snapping toward him. The handler stiffened, sensing the change in the air. The man's lips moved again, and though faint, one juror swore they heard him whisper, "It wasn't supposed to happen this way." The prosecutor seized the moment. She turned toward the jury, her voice low but powerful. "Children do not lie about monsters in their lives. They may not understand our courts, our rules, our procedures, but they understand right and wrong, good and bad. And sometimes, that's the clearest truth of all." The jurors exchanged glances. No one wrote anything down. No one needed to. The words had already carved themselves into their memory. The judge exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. He knew he would need to remind the jury to base their verdict on admissible evidence. But he also knew that trials were not just about facts. They were about people, about perception, about the ability to see the truth beyond the noise. And in this case, the truth had been delivered by a child too young to understand lies. The gallery buzzed with whispers, reporters scribbling furiously, their headlines already forming. Child's words shake courtroom. Police dog and toddler turn case upside down. Cameras outside the courthouse would soon swarm, hungry for the story that would grip the nation. But inside, the room remained tense, fragile, balanced on the edge of something bigger than law. The toddler returned to their guardian, climbing onto the bench with the stuffed bear in hand. They yawned softly, as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. Their small body curled against their aunt's side, eyelids heavy. In their mind, the hardest part of the day was already over. The dog lay back down, head resting on its paws, but its eyes stayed fixed on the accused, watchful, knowing. The accused leaned back in his chair, chest heaving, face damp with sweat. The words "bad man" echoed in his skull, louder than any verdict the jury could deliver. He shook his head, muttering again, and his lawyer grabbed his arm to steady him. But the jurors had seen enough. His composure had cracked. His mask had slipped. And sometimes, that was all it took. The judge looked over the courtroom once more, his voice low. "Court will recess." His gavel fell, but it didn't matter. The sound of it was lost beneath the memory of the child's voice. Two words that had turned the tide of the trial. Two words that would be remembered long after the case was closed. The sound of the gavel still echoed faintly as people rose from their seats, but no one could shake the words that had pierced the courtroom only minutes earlier. "Bad man." 2 syllables, uttered by a toddler, hung in the air long after the judge declared recess. The jurors filed out slowly, their expressions stunned, almost dazed. They were told to disregard what they had heard, to remember only the admissible evidence, but human minds don't work like that. A few of them exchanged subtle glances, silent conversations in their eyes. The order was impossible. No one could unhear the child. The prosecutor sat rigidly at her table, papers untouched. Normally, she would have used the recess to reorganize, review, prepare her next move. But now she simply sat back, staring at the child who had returned to their guardian's lap. Her throat was dry. She had fought for weeks, presenting every scrap of evidence she could muster, and in less than a breath, a 3-year-old had said more than she ever could. The defense attorney, on the other hand, moved quickly. He leaned into his client, voice low but urgent, his words spilling out in rapid-fire whispers. The accused nodded sharply at first, then shook his head, his gestures erratic. His face was pale, his lips pressed thin, his jaw tight. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff with the ground crumbling beneath him. The police dog remained calm, head resting on its paws, though its eyes never left the accused. Its handler stood beside it, hand lightly gripping the leash, watching the tension ripple through the room. The dog didn't need to bark. It didn't need to growl. Its silence carried more weight than noise ever could. Up in the gallery, the spectators whispered in hushed tones, excitement and disbelief mixing together. Some clutched notebooks, others typed frantically into their phones. The reporters scribbled as fast as they could, already crafting headlines in their minds. Toddler stuns courtroom with 2 words. Police dog and child silence jury. The testimony that wasn't supposed to happen. The aunt holding the child stroked the little one's hair, whispering soft reassurances. The toddler, oblivious to the chaos their words had caused, sucked their thumb and leaned against her shoulder, drifting toward sleep. To them, the moment was already past. But for everyone else, it was just beginning. When the judge exited the chamber, his robe swishing behind him, he carried the weight of a decision heavier than most. He knew the jury couldn't disregard what had just happened, no matter what he instructed. He also knew the defense would demand some sort of remedy, perhaps a mistrial, perhaps a dismissal of the jury's emotional reaction. But deep inside, he felt the same chill everyone else did. The innocent voice of a child had spoken something raw, unpolished, and undeniable. Back at the defense table, the attorney gripped his client's arm. "You need to stay calm," he hissed. Losing composure will only confirm their doubts. But the accused couldn't stay calm. His breathing was shallow, his fists clenched. The image of the child's small, unwavering finger pointing at him burned in his mind. He had prepared for everything: evidence, testimony, cross-examination, but not this. Not the unfiltered truth from a mouth too young to be coached, too innocent to lie. The prosecutor rose, walking deliberately toward the hallway outside. She needed air, space to think. As she passed by the jury box, she caught sight of their faces shaken, wide-eyed, more alive than they had been all trial. Doubt had been their constant companion for weeks. Now doubt had an enemy. In the hallway, cameras and microphones were already waiting. Reporters swarmed like bees to honey, their questions overlapping in a frenzy. Did you expect this? Will the child's words change the direction of the trial? Do you believe the jury will be swayed? She offered no comment, her jaw firm, but inside, her heart pounded. She knew the truth. The trial had already shifted. Inside, the defense attorney sat down hard, rubbing his temples. His plan of dismantling the prosecution's case piece by piece had been flawless until now. Facts could be bent, twisted, reframed. But the raw truth spoken by a child? That was a weapon he couldn't fight with logic. Every attempt to dismiss it as irrelevant only made him look desperate. One juror, a middle-aged man with glasses, leaned close to the woman beside him as they waited in the jury room. He whispered, "I've heard a lot of testimonies. None of them cut like that." The woman nodded slowly. "Kids don't know how to fake that kind of thing." Back in the main chamber, the accused shifted in his seat again. Sweat dampened the collar of his shirt. His hands shook as he reached for a glass of water, spilling a few drops as he lifted it to his lips. He caught the dog's eyes steady, piercing, unblinking, and turned away quickly, his stomach churning. The recess dragged on, though it was only 20 minutes. Every tick of the clock seemed louder, more pronounced, as though time itself was emphasizing the words over and over. Bad man, bad man, bad man. When the bailiff announced the judge's return, the courtroom snapped back to attention. People shuffled back into their seats. The jurors filed in, their expressions more guarded now, but the memory of the moment still fresh in their eyes. The judge looked over the room, his voice calm but commanding. The court reminds all present that emotional outbursts, regardless of origin, are not evidence and must not weigh to deliberations. It was the right thing to say. It was the professional thing to say. But everyone knew it was futile. The prosecutor rose, ready to continue. She glanced once at the child, now sleeping softly against their aunt's shoulder, then at the dog, sitting tall as if guarding the truth itself. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a new strength. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard evidence, testimony, and argument. And while I cannot ask you to weigh the words of a child, I ask you this: when truth speaks, in whatever form, can it really be ignored? The defense attorney slammed his fist onto the table. Objection. This is exactly the kind of manipulation we warned against. Sustained, the judge replied quickly, though his tone lacked conviction. But it didn't matter. The seed had been planted. The jury had heard the words, had seen the reaction, had felt the silence. The trial could continue. Evidence could pile higher. Arguments could rage louder, but nothing could erase the moment when innocence revealed guilt. The accused sat rigid, staring straight ahead, his hands trembling under the table. The walls around him were closing in, and he knew it. The courtroom had been speechless once. Now it was restless, humming with an energy that would not fade. The verdict, though not yet spoken, had already begun to take shape. The trial continued for days, but everyone knew the turning point had already passed. Evidence was still presented, arguments were still made, but the atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed forever. The tension that once belonged to the lawyers now belonged to the jury's silence, the silence of people who had heard something that could not be unheard. The prosecutor sharpened her final arguments, weaving the facts together with precision. She didn't mention the child's words again, not directly. She didn't need to. They lingered like a shadow over every exhibit, every timeline, every testimony. When she looked at the jury, she could see it in their eyes. The connection had been made. The defense attorney fought hard. He pulled apart evidence, questioned witnesses, raised doubts with skill and polish. But each time he spoke, each time he gestured toward his client, there was an unspoken counterweight in the minds of the jurors. Bad man. 2 words that dismantled his carefully built arguments more effectively than any cross-examination ever could. The accused tried to maintain composure. He straightened his suit, kept his head down, avoided the jury's gaze. But his nervous tics betrayed him, the way his hands shook when handling papers, the way his jaw clenched whenever the dog's gaze met his. To the jurors, his silence didn't look like dignity. It looked like guilt pressing down harder with every passing day. The child didn't attend the remaining sessions. Their guardian decided the courtroom was no place for someone so young, especially after their unexpected moment. But their absence didn't lessen their presence. Jurors still pictured the small figure standing bravely in the well of the court, clutching a stuffed bear and pointing with trembling certainty. Reporters wrote about the child daily, their headlines growing bolder. Toddler's innocence may decide trial the voice too small to ignore bad man. 2 words changing everything. The police dog stayed. Always silent, always watchful, it sat beside its handler, its calm authority grounding the room. Jurors glanced at it often, comforted by its presence. To them, the dog was more than an animal. It was a witness in its own right, one that seemed to confirm the child's truth with its steady, unblinking eyes. When the closing arguments came, the air was electric. The prosecutor's final words rang strong. You have been presented with overwhelming evidence of guilt. But beyond evidence, you have seen something else. You have seen the truth in its purest form. The innocence of a child who could not be coached, who could not be corrupted, who spoke only what they saw, what they knew. That innocence cannot be ignored. And now, it is in your hands to protect not only justice, but the very idea that truth still matters. The defense attorney rose one last time, his voice tight with urgency. He implored the jury to focus only on the law, only on admissible evidence, only on the doubt he insisted remained. But his words rang hollow. Each time he tried to cast shadows, the memory of the child's voice cleared them away. The jury deliberated for hours. The world outside waited breathlessly. Reporters camped on the courthouse steps, their microphones and cameras ready to capture history. Inside, the child slept soundly at home, unaware of how their words had shaken the pillars of justice. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell into utter silence. The four persons stood, holding the paper with trembling hands. The accused leaned forward, his eyes hollow, his breath shallow. The judge asked the question, the one that would end it all. "Have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, voice steady. The room braced. In the matter of the state versus the defendant, we find the defendant. Guilty. The word cracked through the courtroom like lightning. Gasps filled the air, followed by silence, then murmurs that rose like waves. The prosecutor exhaled sharply, her shoulders finally lowering after weeks of battle. The defense attorney sank into his chair, face drained of color. The accused slumped, his head dropping into his hands, the fight gone from him. The police dog stood, ears alert, gaze steady on the man now convicted. It didn't bark, didn't move, it simply bore witness. The judge nodded solemnly, his voice carrying the weight of finality. Justice has been served. His gavel fell, but to many in the room, the true gavel had struck days earlier, when a 3-year-old spoke the truth without hesitation. News spread like wildfire. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed and microphones surged forward as the prosecutor gave her statement. She didn't mention the child directly, respecting their innocence, but everyone knew. Reporters wrote stories that stretched across front pages. Television anchors repeated the words again and again. Bad man. The public was captivated. Commentators debated the ethics of allowing a child's words to influence a trial. But the majority of people saw something bigger than law. They saw hope. Hope that innocence still had power, that truth could cut through complexity, that even the smallest voice could make a difference. The child, meanwhile, lived quietly with their guardian, blissfully unaware of their role in history. For them, the courtroom was just a big room where grown-ups argued too much. They played with their toys, hugged their stuffed bear, and laughed at cartoons, untouched by the weight of the adult world. Their innocence, once a weapon, was now protected fiercely by their family. The police dog continued to serve, its reputation growing after the trial. Officers spoke of its composure, its intuition, its presence in the courtroom. To many, the dog became a symbol of loyalty and truth, remembered not just as a trained animal, but as a silent partner in the pursuit of justice. Years later, people still spoke of the trial. Lawyers referred to it in lectures, journalists wrote retrospectives, and citizens recalled the moment they watched the news and heard about the toddler who changed everything. The two words became part of courtroom lore, retold in hushed voices, as a reminder of how fragile and how powerful truth can be. But for those who were in the room that day, the memory was sharper, deeper. They remembered the silence before the words, the way time seemed to stop, the way their hearts pounded, as innocence broke through the walls of doubt. They remembered not just a verdict, but a moment when justice felt real, alive, undeniable. The judge, in his later years, admitted privately that he had never seen anything like it. "I have heard thousands of testimonies," he said once to a colleague, "but none as pure, none as unforgettable as the voice of that child." And so, the legacy of the trial was not just the conviction of a guilty man. It was the reminder that sometimes justice does not arrive dressed in law books or legal arguments. Sometimes it arrives in the simplest of forms, a small voice, 2 words, and the silence that follows. The world moved on, as it always does. New trials began. New headlines filled the papers. New stories captured attention. But for those who remembered, the echo of that day never faded. It lived in the words whispered across dinner tables, in the lessons taught to law students, in the stories retold by jurors to their children. Because once, in a courtroom heavy with doubt, a 3-year-old stood up, pointed a tiny finger, and spoke the truth. 2 words. Words that left everyone speechless. And words that would never, ever be forgotten.